Hey, welcome back to the channel. Sorry, I'm going to minimize that window, otherwise it's going to distract me. So, welcome back to Learn Brick. I'm David. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. Here at Learn Brick, we like to basically talk about and discuss anything related to Lego, whether that's Lego sets, Lego mocks, customization, trivia, whatever. I personally like to focus on, my own creations, which often tend to be based on things that I like in pop culture. So Star Wars, video games, Lord of the Rings, anything like that I find interesting to build. So in this video series, I'm going to be going over my process to building a large scale mock from start to finish. Which this year is going to be a recreation of the Battle of Helm's Deep from the Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. If any of you have not seen that, highly recommend it. For those who have, you kind of have an idea as to what I'm going to be dealing with here. Now, what I get out of this is I'm going to be, able to complete this model bit by bit and, get to share some of my tips and tricks along the way. And if you find something that works for you and helps you to, in a future mock, then hey, great. It's all about just, finding something to put in the toolbox and, learning along the way. If you have any questions throughout the live stream, just shoot it out. I'll answer it as best as I can. And yeah. Sorry about that. Okay, now, sorry. As far as today's video, I decided to focus on something that's pretty important in this particular build, and that's going to be building walls, specifically curved walls. That is a feature that I don't often see in a lot of castle builds for a number of reasons. It's pretty typical because, growing up, if you built Lego castle sets, just due to the nature of Lego bricks being rectangular, it's very common to see rectangular shaped castles, straight walls and straight, square turrets, things like that. If you ever do attend Lego conventions, such as the Brick Slopes convention here in Salt Lake City, Utah, coming up in August, by the way, so if you live in Utah, be sure to get tickets for that. But if you ever attend a Lego convention, castle is one of the biggest themes, easily one of the most popular themes that people participate in. And building a castle with curved walls can be a great way to contrast your build from others. Helm's Deep notoriously doesn't have really any or hardly any straight walls. It has a lot of curved turrets and double layer of curved walls. So being able to execute those well is going to be essential to the build. So I'll be going over a technique that I've used a couple of times and how that is going to work in terms of the overall structure of the build. I'll also discuss some other, curved techniques and what are the pros and cons of some of those. So, yeah. In any case, we'll just dive down to it. So in terms of getting started on a curved wall, I think the best way to start, at least how I find works for me, is to first off determine the scale in which you're going to be building. Now, what does that mean? It's primarily how is that wall going to fit in relation to the rest of the build. So things that you want to know ahead of time before even starting is what's the overall size. So length, the width of the wall, as well as height. Mainly because you want to be able to determine how, once this wall section is completed, how is it going to align with the rest of your build. In terms of, again, going back to Helm's Deep, we'll go back to this top-down shot. That's going to mean how are these curved walls going to align with the causeway in the front gate, as well as the deepening wall that goes off to the left side of the build. And being able to build all those so that they connect seamlessly together so we don't have any gaps, as well as for stability purposes. Okay. But yeah. In any case. Sorry. So, now, what I usually like to do when I'm first figuring that scale out is decide what's the scale of the overall build as well. Now, in this case, I'm going to be doing it minifig scale. So what that's going to mean is that every walkway, every wall, and everything is going to be based off of, a minifigure. How I came to that scale when I was designing the model digitally was I took a screenshot of the gate and figured, okay, so this is how big one of the soldiers is in relation to the gate. Then I know exactly how wide the gate is going to be. And then all I had to do was determine how big that gate was in relation to every other feature of the fortress. Now, for the walls that I'm doing, that's going to mean that they're going to be about 8 studs deep, and then the wall is quite a few studs tall. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. So now, once I figured that out, the next thing to do is collect reference. As I've shown you, I've got quite a few different reference photos. I was lucky enough to talk with someone on ArtStation who had digitally modeled the entire fortress, and he sent me a copy of the model that I was able to reference off of. At first, I tried sketching it out just using triangulation, and that was a bit of a mess. Mainly because there's hardly any square points to go off of, and it was really easy to lose the scale as I was going up. Pardon me, let me silence that. Hold on. My apologies. So, yeah. So in any case, back to that. So get photos. If you can get reference models, that works. Even like statues. Weta, in my case, Weta makes quite a few different collectible models, like miniatures. So that's a good way to get some reference for that. So once you've done that, then the next step that I would say to do would be to do a rough sketch or a small micro scale mock, so that you have a general idea of the whole layout of the build. So in terms of that, one of the biggest things to do is if you're doing a miniature or if you're sketching it out, use graph paper and determine a unit of measurement. So when I do castles, I'll often decide that on graph paper that 1 square would equal so many studs. That way I can scale up as I'm building out, or scale down if I'm doing something smaller. Or you can also use a digital app such as like Illustrator or Photoshop, whatever works for you. I kind of work in between sketching and Illustrator, and then the Studio app, which is available on bricklink.com. So, and then from there, the next step is really just to build. I really prefer to dive into that because it can really be easy to just get caught up on the preparation and never getting to the actual building point. So I'm going to go over this type of wall section and why I build it this way. Now, when I was first going over potential curved wall options for Helm's Deep, there are a number of different ways that you can make curved walls. Some work better than others, in my opinion. Probably the more common one that I see really often is this type, wherein you have alternating square bricks with a 1x1 round brick, which allows you to make for some pretty tight curves and whatnot. Or you see ones that are designed this way and uses hinge plates. So, yeah. And again, they have their pros and cons. But what I'm really looking for in terms of this build is to have a good amount of stability, because the walls are going to be supporting a good amount of weight. So I use this one that is a combination of just like hinge plates and stacked arches, which really make for a really strong setup. Now, to start off on this, as you can kind of see here, I've got several layers of arches, which I have alternating, so that way not one side or the other of the section is stronger. Okay, when these are connected, it can support quite a bit of weight, and I'll be able to stack it up quite high. So, yeah. So while I'm starting on that, we'll just discuss some of the other important aspects of building a curved wall. And part of the building process, at least for me, is really to be able to experiment with things and figure out what works and what doesn't. When I used to work as a brick specialist at a couple of different Lego stores, and that was actually one of the things that I would do to pass the time, was just keep a ton of brick in the apron and then just build throughout the day if ever it was slow, and got to be pretty good at figuring out different build techniques and whatnot. But that's probably the best thing I can recommend for anything like that. If you're looking to get better at your builds and whatnot, is just take some brick and just test it out. You know, test different connections, see what jives, what doesn't, and see what works for the type of aesthetic that you're looking for. Okay. And then also, one other point that I think is really important when it comes to these sort of things is just find a place to start. A lot of times, especially if you're starting out like brand new, it can be really easy to make the mistake of thinking that your build needs to be perfect and that you have to have all the ins and outs figured out before you even get started, which is so far from the truth. I mean, the best thing to do, at least in my opinion, is to just find a place to start and start. You can always find opportunities to improve and revise something, but if you never start on it, it's just going to sit there. You know, it's like continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. And that's not my quote, that's Mark Twain's. So, yeah, it's a good one. Now, that's one aspect I think of building digitally that works really well, is that it gives you the option to make those changes and those refinements a lot easier than you would if you were building physically. The drawback on it, at least in my opinion, is sometimes the computer is much more lenient in terms of what it will let you build. So it'll be like, yeah, we're going to okay that piece going there, even though in reality it doesn't fit, which drives me bonkers sometimes. But yeah, physical building, I also think, gets you a better understanding of better understanding of the spatial relationship between the different pieces. So that's part of the reason why I much rather prefer that. In any case, sorry, gotta love it when you decide to build and you're like totally off on something. But yep. But you know what? That's part of the process, though. I used to have an animation professor that would always encourage you to fail faster. And at first I didn't quite understand that. I always thought that he meant, oh, you're just going to do terrible anyway. But it was really about getting the mistakes out early, so that way you didn't get to the very end of, you know, your project and then find out that you've just made mistake after mistake after mistake. So, yeah. So always try to fail as early as you can. And more importantly, try to learn from those mistakes. It doesn't do anyone any good if you continue to make the mistake. Okay. There we go. But yeah. Now as I'm going up section by section, I'm alternating some brackets as well as some headlight bricks that will allow me to bring some studs out to the front. That is going to let me put tiling across the front that'll give for a really smooth curved surface. That was one thing that I was trying to avoid as I was building this, was getting tons of gaps, which is typical for like a lot of curved walls techniques. So So in any case, if you've just tuned in, let me know what your favorite Lego theme is. Mine is Castle, and that honestly came from honestly, since my childhood, I was huge into castles. First started when my parents had bought me, I think it was this one Black Falcons and Black Falcon set called the Knight Stronghold. That thing was the coolest thing ever, and had a knight that had a full breastplate as well as a helmet with the visor that would drop down, and I was obsessed with that thing. Unfortunately, stupid me took it to a soccer field one day when my brothers were playing, and it fell out of my pocket in the middle of this enormous soccer field. And hilariously enough, I ended up finding it the next year. So the story with him was that he had battle damage from, you know, being in the wild. But yeah. So just got to make sure that I'm getting things on with each layer. And then break it like I just did. So there we go. Now, one of the reasons that I had decided to go with this design was primarily because of its structural integrity. Whenever you're doing a curved wall, it's really important to determine very quickly what your priority is. Do you want it to be strong, or do you want it to just, be, be pretty for pretty's sake, right? And sometimes you can get the benefit of both. Other times you have to make a decision on it. The smaller that you build, the more difficult it is to get the best of both worlds with that. If you're building bigger, it's usually easier to get the visual appeal while keeping it sturdy. In this case, again, that 8 studs, I kind of find a sweet spot on it where it isn't just stable, but it also has that visual aesthetic that I'm going for. One difficult thing, though, is that as I build out, the wall is going to change in its scale relative to the fortress. So I'm going to have to come up with a different technique to build the outer wall versus the inner wall. But again, as we mentioned before, if you build bigger, it's usually a little bit easier to get away with. If I were building microscale, I don't know how I would do that. Honestly, people that build in microscale, you have my utmost respect, because I think that is the hardest way to do things. Cool. So now that we've got that section attached, we can link these with these hinge plates. Probably helps if I have the hinge plate facing the right way. There we go. So we can link them this way, and then they will samp. Don't do that. Again, fail faster, right? This is what happens when you don't pay attention early on. So learn from my mistakes. But in any case, not too bad of a fix. You can just swap these out pretty quickly. This also actually brings up another interesting point in terms of building, and that's learning to self-edit. What that means, at least in this context, is be able to take a step back and evaluate the progress of your build and decide if there needs to be any revisions or changes to it. That can honestly be a little difficult, especially if you're a new builder, because we all have that, those moments where you build something and you've invested so much time and effort into it that it's really easy to look at the mocks that you make through rose-colored glasses. And there's nothing wrong with taking pride in the builds that you make. It's part of the creative process. But it is also equally important to be able to look at it and decide if you've made, a decision that could be revised and made better. So every now and then as you're building, take a step back and take a good hard look and decide, is there something I can improve upon? That's the only way that you get better as a builder, is to constantly look for improvement. Sorry, drink break. So, yeah, find those opportunities to make changes or to test something new out. Because you never know, you might end up stumbling across, a technique that just totally elevates your build. Okay. Now I've got these two sections connected. I'm gonna pull a Martha Stewart and just bring a larger section of the wall that I've already completed. This I did mainly because it's just too time consuming to do all of them on a live stream. So this way you can actually see how that curvature works out. Now don't worry about this bare space. This is actually going to be the spot where one of the turrets, if you can see off to the left side, where that turret is going to come out. So we'll be able to build out from there. But yeah, that worked out pretty well. And this build technique is actually really sturdy and can support a lot of weight. So I'll be able to place another layer on top of that and double the height of this wall without much difficulty. It is a little parts intensive, but luckily I had a ton of these on hand and they were pieces that I hadn't been using and probably wouldn't get around to. So that worked out. For your builds, sometimes you may decide that a technique that you've been using ends up being too parts intensive. So that's, again, where part of that self-editing comes in. Do that with respect to the overall look of the build, but also the cost of it. Unless you are, one of the Lego designers that works in Billund, or, a Lego Masters winner or whatnot, you're probably going to have a shortage of bricks at some point and a specific budget. So define what your budget is, and if you have to make changes, then do that. That's honestly another benefit of designing digitally. It's much easier to come up with those parts lists than it would be doing it just by hand. Now, if you're new, again, kind of going over some of the pros and cons of being new to making mocks. Sometimes it can get really difficult to self-edit and judge your own works with an objective perspective. So one thing you can do, which I recommend anybody does, if you're really looking to progress in something, whether it's Lego building, whether it's art of some sort, any sort of endeavor or hobby, would be to find someone that you trust that can be brutally honest with you about something. So I work as an animator, and when it would come time to get feedback on work that I've been doing, again, it can be very easy to become attached to the work that you do because you invest so much time and effort into it. And sometimes it's very easy to look at that and think, this is so good, I spent so much time, this is worth so much effort. But you might have accidentally just polished crap for a while. So if you do that, again, the advantage is that somebody who you trust and can be brutally honest with you can give you the necessary critiques. And I would just recommend listen to them. Take note. And sometimes you might find that your opinion does disagree, which is fine. You don't have to agree 100% with what other people tell you, but it is a good idea to at least take note of what people recommend that you change. And maybe change one or two things. Bruce Lee actually once said that you should absorb what's useful, discard what's useless, and then add what is specifically your own. Which is, I think, really good words to live by. Because, everyone's going to have their own vision for things. And if you're working on a mock, you know, you have a specific goal that you want to achieve, and sometimes that's going to be different from what other people think you should be doing. And that's up to you to decide whether or not that's going to be, you know, advice that you want to take or not. But you got to be willing to at least put yourself out there and get that criticism first. So yeah. Now, right now I'm working on some steps that are going to go in between some of the curved walls. On the lower part of the fortress, there's actually going to be two curved walls, one of which is going to be built similar to this one, which is this section right here. And then there's going to be another wall that's going to go out here. These steps are actually going to descend going this way, and then on the second layer of curve of the wall, they're going to ascend going upwards. So that's what I'm working on right now. Again, this is another reason why it's a really good idea to sometimes build digitally, so then you know exactly how many different, or how many parts you need. I had to go through, gosh, good like 6 iterations of this mock in order to come up with a design that worked with the parts that I had. Otherwise, that would have been a hefty chunk of change. But yeah. So if you guys watching, what has been a feature in a build that you particularly like? Have you ever built a castle mock? And what was something that you learned along the way? I think for me, the build that really stood out to me in terms of techniques that I learned, probably my first year building for a convention. And I used to build, I mean, as a kid I'd build castles all the time, but they were always, you know, your typical, you know, European medieval style castle, you know, 4 turrets, a wall, you know, connecting walls, and a gatehouse. But I tried to do something that was you know, just a completely different shape than what I was used to. And the thing that really, in my opinion, helped make it a better build than most of my other ones was learning how to texture the walls, so that it wasn't just a plain, you know, plain flat gray wall. And sometimes you want that, but again, going back to what I had mentioned earlier, is that a great way to get your builds to stand out is to make contrast. Contrasting shapes, contrasting colors, you know, and texture can be a really great way to do that. For example, like on these steps, instead of like completely going with nothing but a gray tile, like I can throw some ingot parts there to add just a little bit of texture. Also, alternating tiles and plates can be a good way to do that. Or even just use the different shape of plate or tile. So instead of having all rectangular tiles, you could throw in a circular one, and that can be a really good way to give it some visual contrast. Plus, it can also make it look like it's had repairs. So, and that's another thing that's really important to do as well whenever you're building like something like this, is to find ways to make it look authentic or lived in, and to make it look like it's actually under, like, sorry if I can make this a drinking game. How many times can I say the word like? No. Find ways to make it look like an authentically lived in space, whether that be cracks in the walls or debris that's scattered around the corners of the walkways. Anything that lends to a space where people have actually been moving and fighting and whatnot. So, but I think that whenever we're building, it can be really tempting to try to make everything perfect. Especially when you're going to be displaying it for people. It's really easy to just want to have everything aligned perfectly, but imperfections are what make things look authentic. So don't be afraid to just try to do something that looks a little different and see where it takes you. Okay. One thing that also really helps with that is you could always try You could always try putting plants or of some sort or whatnot along the wall as you go. Let's see. There we go. So this is how that's going to work. See? So that way we can have staircase descending down the walkway. Okay. Let's turn it out pretty good. Like that. Okay. That turned out pretty good. Okay. Well, I want to thank those of you that tuned in. So, again, this will be added to our Helm's Deep build, which we'll be continuing in our next live stream. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to leave it in the comments, and I can get back to you on that. And then if you have any questions regarding any of the mocks that we've done on the channel, including instructions for those, feel free to send me a message. I'm more than willing to share those if there's something that you find interesting or compelling. So thanks for tuning in. You guys have a good day. Take care.